All right. Thanks, everyone, for being with us for our closing panel. I'm really excited to be here and continue learning from these women who I've already been lucky enough to talk to a couple times ahead of time and learned a lot from already. So I will start by letting you know who they are. Right next to me is Dr. Amanda Williams, who is an OBGYN and Chief Medical Officer of the March of Dimes, which was founded to fight polio and today fights for the health of all moms and babies and to close the health equity gap. Next to her is Professor Jamie Abrams, who's a law professor at American University, whose research focuses on reproductive and birthing decision-making, gendered violence, and legal education pedagogy. And on the end is Professor Nicole Huberfeld, who's a law professor at Boston University, who studies the intersection of health law and constitutional law, and since the Dobbs decision, if not before, has been working to advise doctors about its effects for their practices, including especially on cancer care, which is our topic. And it's a topic whose meaning has changed for me in the time just since this panel was first being planned, because I think, like many of us, I previously thought of cancer care and cancer research as sort of an edifice that existed nonpartisanly and uncontroversially, and that the maternal care part of this was that edifice had problems with gender bias, with race bias, with disparities, and particularly as it intersects with reproductive care, but that it was the person the person who was needing the intersecting maternal and cancer care who was in the problematic position. And from that perspective, Dobbs wreaked devastation to care for patients across the country. But as has been mentioned several times in the last 6 weeks, we've seen a whole nother level of attack on health, where that edifice in my mind of American science research is being demolished before our eyes and creates another entire level and set of problems. So we'll be looking at pieces of that, some of the pieces on the ground in this talk. And so we're going to start out by grounding ourselves in some data. Professor Huberfeld is going to start with some information about the national situation regarding the impact that Dobbs has had over the last few years on cancer care. And I know that she has some maps that she's going to show us, so I wanted to mention, I think that I'm going to predict that you will see in those maps some visual patterns that you have seen before in maps of the country. And I want to remind everyone of Dr. Goodwin's comments this morning about the history that lies behind those maps and why you'll be able to see the Confederacy in those maps. So it's her comments to have in mind as we get into the data.
Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here. And I know we're doing a sitting down comfortable thing, but I'm going to stand up because it's the last panel and I've got standing up energy right now. So I hope that's okay with everybody because, and I want to apologize that I missed some of the comments earlier. I actually was running from one conference to another, but I'm really glad to be here and really glad to hear what I've heard and really honored to be part of this conversation. So thank you so much for having me. And I have been hearing very compelling information and stories about how important it is to think about the nature of discrimination in the kinds of care that we can access. I'd like to add to that story by adding geography and the fact that our zip code dictates our health to the conversation. And this isn't just about the Confederacy, though that matters, but what I'm going to show you, rather than just tell you, is that our location matters. It shouldn't, but it does. And the reason that I study federalism, which probably just put you to sleep instantaneously, is that this governance dynamic of relying on the states to implement most of our health laws and most of our public health laws has an impact on how anything happens when it comes to our health. And so I think it's really vitally important to understand that law is a determinant of health. And so because the court has told us that it is returning the issue of abortion to the people and their elected representatives. And though that does not only mean the states, that also means Congress, right? The states believe that it means them. And I think that's an important point here, too, that state legislators are running away with this power that's been given to them by Dobbs. And so it's not necessarily that we are talking about this map or versions of it that we've seen all over the place recently, right? But rather that we should understand that this is a proxy for what is happening now, but also demonstrates patterns that have been happening in our nation for quite a while. So I'll just talk for a couple of minutes to set us up for this really important conversation about the effect of Dobbs on cancer care and maternal health in cancer care. So even before Dobbs, where you lived mattered in terms of the kinds of care that you could access. Abortion care was just one version of that. This is a map from some of my colleagues, actually at BU School of Public Health. They were studying the fact that if you lived in a state that was aggressively trying to challenge Roe and Casey pre-Dobbs, so if you lived in a state that was trying to restrict access to abortion care before Dobbs, you would still be living in a state where maternal mortality rates were higher, again, pre-Dobbs. They were able to show that maternity care resources by state abortion policies varied. They were able to show that maternal deaths were higher in states that were restricting access to abortion. And in states that were restricting access to abortion, people capable of pregnancy were more likely to rely on Medicaid for their care. This is all pre-Dobbs. And these patterns show up again and again and again. Infant mortality rates are higher in these states. Teen birth rates are higher in these states. People are more likely to have chronic conditions in these states. And it leads to what March of Dimes very helpfully has measured, the Maternal Vulnerability Index, which incorporates not just health care per se, but also the drivers of health, so that we can understand all of the things that make people vulnerable in their reproductive years. This is also a story about Medicaid expansion. And because I study both health law and reproductive care, I think it's important to bring this factor in. When we think about what it is that makes populations resilient or vulnerable, we have to understand that if you don't have a way to pay for care, you are going to be left out even more than you would be otherwise. And so these maps also reflect what we have seen in terms of expanding Medicaid eligibility under the Affordable Care Act, which, by the way, is about to turn 15 in a week. We know, too, and this is interesting, Medicaid expansion is one of the most studied insurance phenomena ever. There are more than 600 studies showing the benefits of Medicaid expansion. And these benefits include not only the things that you might expect, like, oh, hey, people actually do get insurance coverage from Medicaid, which, by the way, was a political question mark, but also people have their cancers diagnosed earlier and are more likely to have successful courses of treatment if there is Medicaid expansion in the state. We also have had micro-studies showing that in clusters of states in the South, for example, people are more likely to have earlier diagnosis of breast cancers if they're in Medicaid expansion states, and they're more likely to have successful treatment of their breast cancers. We can take a look back to and see that in these areas where Medicaid expansion was slow to occur and or is still occurring, because we still have 10 states that haven't expanded Medicaid, there are higher cancer death rates, and they are even higher if you look at a 5-year period rather than a 1-year period. And even more compellingly, cancer death rates are higher for females than males in these areas. So when we look at these issues, it's important to see that we're not just talking about health outcomes for patients. We should also be considering what Dobbs and its progeny amongst the states are doing to the healthcare workforce. We heard on the prior panel that we should be thinking about what it means to have health professional shortages. We already had health professional shortages. We already had medically underserved areas in the United States, but they are getting worse after Dobbs. And they're getting worse in very concrete ways. One of the things that is easiest to measure is where people are applying for medical residencies. And this just shows you where existing health professional shortage areas are. We can see that if we look in terms of the non-nuanced but helpful categories of places where abortion is banned, places where there are gestational limits and abortion, places where abortion is legal, that residents are making choices to not go to the states where abortion bans exist. This is data that is being collected by the American Association of Medical Colleges, and this is the year after Dobbs, right? So we see 2022 to 2023, and this is most notable, of course, for not just what it is showing us about the states themselves, but the kinds of changes that are occurring across primary care and critical specialties. So this isn't just an OBGYN story, it's a primary care story, it's an emergency medicine story, and it's a story that is going to matter in terms of the subject matter of this panel, because it is primary care physicians who find the cancers. And let's add to that, that states are trying to push Planned Parenthood out of Medicaid, which means that there will be fewer healthcare providers detecting cancers for people of reproductive age. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Nicole, for all of that information. And we're going to continue educating you. Professor Abrams is going to talk to us about who the people are navigating all these mazes in the states, trying to access their healthcare and the options they have, talking about both her research and her experience going through that maze.
Great. First, I'll start with just some very quick demographics to reinforce the points that Nicole made and to set up this idea that cancer care, like abortion care, looks very different depending on where you are and who you are. This first picture, this is just breast cancer. You can see breast cancer incidence rates skew heavily north and east, while breast cancer mortality rates skew south and southeast and Midwest, as aligned with Nicole's slides. Cervical cancer rates here as well, disproportionate mortality rates, again, in the South and in the Midwest. When we think about cuts to global aid, I'll also mention very briefly that 94% of deaths from cervical cancer occur in lower and middle income countries, and in particularly in the global South. Overall, breast cancer rates have plummeted, which is great news, from 1980 to now, largely attributed to better prevention and screening. So that's good news at first glance, but notably those breast cancer mortality declines have not mapped the same for women. And so this map begins in 1970s and 1980s. So the red line is Black women, the blue line is white women, and you can see tracks quite similarly from the 70s and the 80s. Then Black women experience a considerable spike, and then as that death rate comes down, it doesn't come down enough to address the spike that occurred in the 1990s. Asian American and Pacific Islander women, likewise, a very different trajectory to that chart. It's pretty flat. For cancer mortality, breast cancer, specifically mortality rates. Overall, while the mortality rate has come down, breast cancer incidence rates have gone up. And so you can see here it's sort of 2010 is really the mark where it starts to cut up even steeper in 2016. And again, the demographics are notable. So incidence rates, again, highest for white women, but when we look particularly at the mortality rate, we can see a very different picture with Black women, Asian, Indian, and Alaska Native women more likely to suffer mortality from breast cancer rates. This slide, I think, might be the most shocking to me. This suggests that the rate of new breast cancer cases among Asian American and Pacific Islander women has spiked 52% from 2000 to 2021, higher than any other racial or ethnic category. And similarly, we see the same in problematic racial disparities for Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders in cervical cancer deaths, as well as Black women and American Indian women, almost 3 times higher in that first category. If you're not a visual person and you want to see words, this has some of the same data Dr. Pleasant presented previously. 9% of all new breast cancer cases are women younger than 45. In a moment, I'll tell my story of being one of those statistics. Black women are 40% more likely to die from breast cancer, as Dr. Pleasant presented, have the lowest survival rate of any racial or ethnic group. Black women more likely to be diagnosed with triple negative breast cancer, which is particularly aggressive and more complex to treat. And notably, breast cancer affects men too, and even Black men have worse prognosis and outcomes from relative to white women, or white men rather. And so, do you want me to keep going into the, and so all of that data became very real for me on May 2nd of 2022. That date might stand out to you as well. If you happen to remember, that's also the date the Dobbs opinion was leaked. So that morning, I woke up to a very early call from my OBGYN telling me that I had breast cancer. It arose from a standard mammogram at a standard annual screening. By the time I got to the point of the phone call, after all the tests and the biopsies and seeing all the charts pop up in my file, that part was not the surprise. The surprise was the next thing that she said, which was also discontinue your hormonal contraceptive and you will never take contraception again. And that news startled me because before that, I had previously thought of breast cancer as sort of more of a monolithic and had never parsed the different types or the different ways in which they interact with one's body. And so I quickly learned that the kind of cancer I had was hormone-positive breast cancer, which means that cancer cells can bind to those estrogen and progesterone cells, which makes, while a small risk, a risk that nonetheless was no longer tolerable for me to take the hormonal birth control, but also suggesting that were I to become pregnant in an environment which I was now less able to control, the physiological implications of being pregnant and the hormonal changes that triggers would also be deeply complicated in my cancer care. So that same night, the Dobbs opinion leaked, and so like many of you in the room, I spent the day grieving that, along with grieving a cancer diagnosis. And so in the coming days and weeks, as I went through both the cancer care and seeing ultimately the Dobbs opinion finally published in all the horrors that it previewed back in May, I really keenly felt on a very human level the essential point that medical care, as we know and as we've seen today, is informed mightily by women's reproductive health. I saw very quickly that while I was not pregnant and did not become pregnant, the fact that I could governed every aspect of the care that I received. And notably, at the time, I was also in the middle of a job move from Kentucky to Virginia, from an abortion ban, what became an abortion ban state, to a purple-ish state that does still have abortion access. And I quickly saw some of the differences in those care models. Every appointment, the very first questions ask about prior pregnancies, pregnancy losses, prior abortions, and there was an unspoken trust that I would tell the truth, that I would feel safe, that I would be safe giving that information. There was an unspoken sharing of information and an assumption that all the providers in my team would be safe to have that information and to have accurate information. That information would be fed into studies, again, assuming that the information people gave was safe and accurate. During all the care, the first thing that happens is a pregnancy test. During all the 30 radiation treatments, the key piece of it is protecting my uterus from radiation exposure. And through all of that, I really felt keenly the sort of break between the morning panel and the afternoon panel, which is at the age of 43, I was sort of lucky to be on the other side of child rearing, which meant I didn't need to take the really important steps that many women in the 20s and 30s that Dr. Pleasant mentioned need to take to preserve their fertility. But at 43, it also meant that I was going to be catapulted to the second panel and would be one of those patients that Dr. Pleasant described as being forced into menopause at 43. And so, ultimately, including that the path of the cancer care ultimately led to so many uterine cancer scares that I ultimately ended up having a hysterectomy as well to manage the risk of recurrence. And so I say all that very simply to frame and set up the next point, which is that in all of that experience, I keenly felt that the idea that the Supreme Court could put abortion care in a box and carve it out and say we're just sending abortion decision-making to the states was an incredible fiction and a myth and a really problematic and harmful one. So behind every one of those statistics about lost providers, everything we've heard today about lost providers, that's losses in cancer screenings, losses in pap smears, losses in mammograms, all of the things that are so important. And then the very last thing I'll say, and is that this really also revealed in the kind of care that I was getting, particularly in our breast cancer culture, the kind of care that I received was staggeringly different than the way in which we interact as a society with abortion care seekers. So to sit in rooms filled with waterfalls and donors and named wings and balloon arches and pink and swag and merch and stuff coming in the mail and love and support and meal trains and GoFundMes and all the things that come with cancer care, while as a country we were ratcheting and ratcheting and ratcheting up to levels that sort of defy our even worst expectations in how we treat abortion care, when from my side of it, it was the exact same thing. What kinds of decisions did I want to make with my body? What access to insurance did I have? What medical leave did I have? None. I had just started a new job. And so all sorts of really important conversations, ways in which the medical care felt so different from what abortion care looks like, while at the same time I was realizing that the medical treatment was so deeply intertwined and interconnected in ways that really exposed the problems in the Dobbs decision.
Thank you so much. And I think that really leads, nicely into, I want to ask Dr. Williams to share some of her experience with how providing that care differs, and the way that law, especially recently, has been coming into your practice, coming into the emergency room, what kinds of things you have been facing.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and thank you, Jamie, for sharing your story. Ultimately, we are all here because we care about this issue a lot. And I'm going to take the privilege of inviting us to a collective breath, because this is hard. So a deep breath in, a hold at the top, and slower out. And people ask me all the time, like, Amanda, how do you do this? Like, how do you stay in the fight? Like, because this is an attack. As Melissa said earlier, this is full frontal. As I said to my acupuncturist, I feel like I'm being attacked. And he said, Amanda, you are being attacked. And it is true. And this is it's a difficult space to be in. And so now that, all of us, our therapists have earned their $200 an hour, we now steel ourselves to be ready. And as Alexis said earlier, we're going to drive this car like we stole it. Like, we are going to do this work. And it's not a coincidence that we find ourselves in this time, and we've got to now make the most of it. Now, I know that I was here to be the storyteller, and I will be a storyteller. I'm also a health equity, NIH and CDC funded researcher who is probably going to lose their funding this year. And we have to keep going and find, alternative funding sources, and it absolutely can be done. But this is really a moment. It's really a moment for all of us who care so deeply about this work. So and this has happened, unfortunately, too many times in my career. Oftentimes, pregnancy is a first touch point for many young, healthy women in the medical system. And so you come in, oftentimes, if you're not up to date on your pap smear, you might get a pap or you might get a cervical cancer screening because you're thinking about getting pregnant. And then the patient comes back and it's, yes, you're pregnant, and you have precancerous cells. So what are we now going to do about that? Are we going to do our cone biopsy to look for your LEEP to look for or treat your precancerous lesions on your cervix? Are we going to allow your pregnancy? Is precancer good enough for a threat to the life of the mother? The idea that we can legislate our way through medical nuance is a joke. And it sets up a discourse around good abortions or deserved abortions versus bad abortions. So is an abortion okay if you have precancerous cells on your cervix? Is an abortion okay if you have a chromosomal abnormality? Is it okay if you need your chemotherapy for your breast cancer? Or is it not okay because you are a college student and want to keep getting your education? Is it not okay because you already have 3 kids at home and you know that you'll no longer be able to provide for them? This notion that there are ways in which certain abortions are okay and certain abortions are not okay, and that there's a line between them, I think creates this just false dichotomy that has become the joke of what is trying to legislate the practice of medicine. And then we see it at then a deeper level, or just another element of it, in the emergency room. And whenever I've been on in the last couple of years, because when we're working on labor and delivery, we'll often take consults from the emergency room. And you get a call down, you know, Mrs. Jones is a 33-year-old, gravida 3, pair 2. She's 8 weeks pregnant. She is a confirmed IUP, she's bleeding. It looks like she's having an incomplete AB. Amanda, will you come down and take a look and see if you want to do a DNC on her? So for me, I grab my resident, we go down, we handle her business. For my colleague, Kelly, who is we're 20 years out of residency now, OBGYN in Houston, she has the exact same patient. And so when I go downstairs, I talk to my patient, I apologize, I make sure her needs are taken care of, she gets pain medication, and I see that she's bleeding very actively. I'm going to do her DNC because if I don't, she's going to end up with a blood transfusion. She's going to end up infected. She could be septic. We know where this goes. This is not the research that we're talking about. This is evidence-based care. But my colleague Kelly was in the exact same position in Houston. And a clerk, the registration clerk at that emergency room, threatened her that she was going to call the police on her if she did this patient's DNC. And Kelly was like, what am I supposed to do? You know, this is my patient. I've been taking, this is her 3rd kid, pregnancy. I've taken care of her for years. I care about her. So when do we think it then becomes acceptable to do a DNC for the life of the woman? Is it when you transfuse 1 unit? Do you have to make 4 units in order for it to be acceptable? Do you have to meet SIRS criteria for sepsis in order for it to be acceptable? Is it okay if you're going to the ICU, but let me call the lawyer for my hospital system who is, I don't know, where do you lawyers go? Off on the golf course somewhere. But it's the weekend, it's the night, and you're not available. We cannot legislate this degree of medical nuance. And when we try to create these differences, these allowable versus good versus bad types of pregnancy termination, we're going to continually get ourselves into this spiral. So when we create these compromises with different gestational age limits, we're actually, and I can't remember who brought it up earlier, just reinforcing this idea of fetal personhood that just becomes more palatable at some gestational age versus another. But in truth, this is all control over women's bodies and trying to legislate medicine. And as Nicole brought up, the impact on the OBGYN workforce has been devastating. We already know that 35%, that's over a third, y'all can do math, of all counties in the United States are maternity care deserts. And when we say maternity care deserts, what we mean is there's no hospital with a labor and delivery unit, there's no licensed birth center, there's no obstetrician, and no midwife. A third of the counties in the United States have none, not 2 or 3 or 4, none of those 4 things. And now we have fewer people going into obstetrics, fewer going into obstetrics in the states with the strictest abortion bans. It's like they want women to die. But wait, maybe they actually do. Maybe they actually do want us to suffer. Maybe they actually do want us to die. Maybe if we're not producing for the plantation, that our bodies are not valued at all. And so when we make these compromises, we're really going down a very slippery slope.
Thank you for that and for the breath. I realized I'd been holding a lot all day. So I have a couple of things I want to pick up on from those comments and ask people to elaborate on. So I'll send the first one to Professor Huberfeld, but everyone can feel free to jump in. But that's the emergency room and the decisions happening there and the legislation of medicine. The word EMTALA has come up a couple of times in the course of the day as it is a representative of both of those spaces, and I wanted to ask you to talk about what that effort to push back, what state it's in now. And we are in a law school, so you are allowed to say federalism.
And nobody fell asleep in self-defense, so it was good. So if you're not familiar with EMTALA, it's the Emergency Medical Treatment and Labor Act. It is actually an amendment to Medicare. It is a Medicare condition of participation that makes it so that any hospital that accepts Medicare as payment must treat you if you show up in their emergency department with a medical emergency. So this is the reason that if you go to an emergency department, no matter who you are, where you live, whether you can pay, you can get care. That's EMTALA. A lot of people can't name it, but that's what it is. EMTALA was created at a time when we had a constitutional baseline that made it so that access to abortion care pre-viability was protected. And so there was no question when EMTALA was enacted in 1986 as to whether access to abortion for medical emergencies was also protected by EMTALA, because it was constitutionally protected. We didn't also need specific statutory protection. So hospitals were making it so that people who couldn't pay or who were otherwise deemed undesirable couldn't get care that they needed in emergency departments. And even after EMTALA was enacted, hospitals found loopholes for EMTALA, and one of them was if someone was early in a pregnancy and was experiencing problems with the pregnancy but wasn't in active labor, the hospital would say, oh, it's not a medical emergency, we don't have to treat you. So EMTALA was amended to include specifics about active labor and actually took the word active out of the law so that it would be clearer what it meant for hospitals to have this obligation if they were taking Medicare money. So EMTALA also has a legislative history that shows us that the law was designed to create a point of rescue for everybody that was not just to save people's lives, but also to protect their health. And this is not, again, abortion specific. It is health specific. It is a law that is our one actual universal access to care law in the United States. EMTALA is actually radically powerful, but we have forgotten it. It is the one law that does that. The Affordable Care Act is our universal health insurance coverage law. People often say, oh, that's universal care. No, it's not. It's universal health insurance coverage. EMTALA is universal access, meaning you actually get care under EMTALA. Okay, so post-Dobbs, we're familiar with the maps. States start either, their trigger bans come into effect or they have laws that they're enacting that either criminalize abortion or create severe restrictions on abortion. Most important for this conversation is the states taking the most radical turn. States like Idaho, which for my money is the worst right now. Sorry for anybody who's from Idaho. Idaho has criminalized abortion, and in fact, its first version of its criminal abortion ban, if you're not familiar with it, actually made it so that the physician could only raise saving the life of the pregnant person as a defense to the crime of providing an abortion. So you, if you're not familiar with what this means, would have to admit that you committed the crime, but that you had a good reason to do so. Needless to say, this is part of the reason that nearly a quarter of the OBGYNs have left the state of Idaho entirely. Okay, so this creates a conflict with EMTALA because hospitals in states like Idaho have a federal obligation to provide the care that is necessary in medical emergencies to preserve health and life. But Idaho has a law that will only allow for an abortion in a medical emergency to prevent death. There is a conflict there. The Biden administration said that conflict is one that makes it so that federal law preempts state law. So to the extent that state law is narrower, it can't stand. This made it up to the Supreme Court in the Moyle case. The Supreme Court said, oh, we granted the case too early, sorry. But there are concurrences and dissents in the Moyle decision basically saying, we want to hear more about this. Bring us more information. We want to understand whether the federal government can actually use money in this way to influence the regulation of medicine at the state level. Goes back down to the Ninth Circuit, continues to be litigated. The Trump administration has just decided it is no longer interested in pursuing the preemption theory of the Moyle case. But St. Luke's Health System, which is the biggest health system in Idaho, has taken it up. And by the way, St. Luke's is not a Catholic hospital system. You might assume that it is from the name. It was originally, I think, Episcopalian, but is affiliated with nothing now. It's just a nonprofit community hospital system that treats, I think they deliver close to half of the babies that are delivered in Idaho right now. St. Luke's is a powerhouse, so they've got resources. St. Luke's was also one of the reasons that Idaho expanded Medicaid, actually. So the case will continue, but not because the Trump administration is pursuing it. In the meantime, what we have is an intractable conflict between the law of universal access to medical care for medical emergencies and state laws that criminalize abortion and only allow for life-saving exceptions. That is an intractable conflict. There is no middle point there. Just like there's no middle point between a state that criminalizes access to abortion and a state that protects it under a shield law. We have conflicts between laws that are all over the United States map right now that we don't have answers for. In my view, we actually have an easy answer here. EMTALA is the law of the land. And the federal government didn't change EMTALA. The Supreme Court changed the constitutional standard, and then states ran away with it. And by the way, states are not trying to make medically accurate decisions as they legislate these questions. They seem to think that they can surgically extract access to abortion from all of the other kinds of necessary care that exist for people of reproductive age, which is exactly why we need to talk about things like cancer care, because you cannot surgically extract it. That's the EMTALA story.
Thank you. And thank you for giving us a state other than Alabama to pick on.
Well, one more word about Idaho. Idaho's also the state that disbanded their maternal mortality review committee. One of now a handful of them who've disbanded their maternal mortality review committee. And we just in January, I sit on the committee in California, and a bunch of us from around the country came together at the Society for Maternal Fetal Medicine in January, and the CDC representative was not allowed to be there. And then in Texas, that has the, which is sort of like our test case. Like we look to see what has happened in Texas to see what's now going to happen in terms of maternal and infant morbidity and mortality. Texas does not analyze first trimester cases anymore. So if you are having a miscarriage, if you are having an ectopic pregnancy, you die and they bury the bodies.
Can I follow up on that? What do you see as the prospects for nonprofit or other sectors to take over some of the knowledge capacity, the research, the data gathering that is now being lost at the federal government because the states aren't picking that up, right? They're burying the bodies. Do you see opportunities to build more resilient systems outside of government, or do you just see loss?
No, I do think that there are some examples, and of course I'm not biased because I'm associated with two big ones. At Stanford, we have the Maternal Data Center, so every single hospital in the state of California is part of the Maternal Data Center, and so we take all of the hospital outcomes for moms and babies, link them to vital statistics records from the state of California, put them together, and then each hospital can look at the analytics that are coming out of it. Washington, Oregon, we have about 75% of their births, and then a handful from around the country. So there is still big data happening. And then at March of Dimes, for any of the learners in the room, you still can have, it's open access to our peristats, which takes federal, county, and state level data. So we're always cross-checking our outcomes. Everything can be stratified by race, ethnicity. Some can be stratified by payer type, depending on the outcomes that you're looking at. So the aegis of responsibility on nonprofits to get this work done becomes even more important.
Thanks. There's time for me to ask one more question, and then we'll open it up for all of you. This is for everyone. I'll ask Professor Abrams to start it off, though, with a question about what our activism and our work should look like in light, particularly of this issue that has come up at least 5 times over the course of the day, which Dr. Williams referred to as the good abortion versus bad abortion. Like, is the good abortion because you have cancer, but the bad abortion is the elective one, and is that even a thing? But that has come up also with the question of, is menopause the good issue that can build bridges, but it's dangerous? It came up on the first panel this morning about the people discovering that their IVF, the good moms who were doing IVF discovered that they were hurt by the bad moms getting abortions. And Karen Thompson also mentioned what I wrote as, maybe you don't care about grace, but they'll get you too. And so, and you mentioned the pink ribbon advocacy around women's health. How do you navigate that, given that in the law we're often so motivated to draw lines and make distinctions and say, oh, well, yes, Dobbs said those abortions were bad, but mine's good. How should we think about that?
Yeah, I think there's need for great vigilance in this space. My observation of American breast cancer culture is it is the functional medical equivalent of you should smile more, right? It's driven by being hopeful. I'm a warrior. I'm going to fight cancer. I'm going to beat cancer. I beat cancer, right? And there's so many more varied experiences packed into that, but there is a rhetoric and a culture that expects women to take breast cancer a certain way, and it's deeply problematic. It also yields a lot of breast cancer care that is functionally aesthetic care, and so I think there's a lot of space for vigilance. I previously published a paper in the Missouri Law Review doing a linguistic study of the amicus briefs that were filed in Roe, Casey, and Dobbs, and we were able to splice it by who filed them and on what side, and look for disproportionalities. The number 1 and number 2 most common words used in the medical provider briefs filed against abortion access in all 3 of those cases were breast and cancer. What does that tell you? It tells you how breast cancer has already been weaponized as a tool to scare folks out of abortion access. Back in the days when now abortion ban states used informed consent scripts, many of them used scripts that were medically problematic. So I think that's one piece. Second, and then I'll stop because I know we want to get to Q&A. I am very vigilant to the way in which hormone therapies that treat breast cancer are intertwined with both abortion access and gender-affirming care. And in a world of dwindling resources and upending of our healthcare systems and supply chains, particularly, the drug I take is tamoxifen. I'm in a Facebook support group with tens of thousands of women in there who almost every single week are confused about what drug they're actually taking. So questions like, I'm traveling to Florida with my tamoxifen. Can I enter the state of Florida with my, quote, gender-affirming care, right? Lots of confusion about what drugs that affect hormones are, lots of fear-mongering, lots of scare tactics. Like, 2 quick points, the drug tamoxifen, which is standard of care for hormone-positive breast cancer for some women, can be used as a replacement to mifepristone when used with misoprostol. And so I worry that in a world of supply chain upending, that the entire breast cancer industry and all the fervor that goes with it could be turned in an instant on both gender-affirming care and abortion access when that drug gets more attention. So those are the couple things. And then the last thing I'll say, just as a torts person, to draw out on the medical piece, I also worry that in tort law, the law is what most women would do or what most doctors would do can become the standard of care for tort law. And so tort law often plays a very important backstop role in protecting standards of care. But I worry here that we are effectively codifying via the tort system if we're not speaking up more actively in the cancer care space. So I think there's a lot of need for vigilance to avoid this good abortion, bad abortion narrative.
Thank you all for your stories and your data. Now you may thank me.